One of the major psychological problems that is a problem with for a lot of people is the tendency to depression. This is only really critical if it assumes such proportions that the person can't function, that they can't go on through their daily life, or if it becomes actually destructive, especially self-destructive. And for depression, you would look particularly in the chart for heavy water, usually with also some earth. The earth and water signs and planets and houses, all three are important as part of it, tend to be the downers. And if a chart is primarily water and earth, there's a tendency for it to be a kind of heavy person who feels weighted down, loaded down, burdened by life in one way or another. Now, earth by itself is just pragmatic and realistic and hardworking. So it's not a threat unless there's an awfully strong water component. Water is pretty much the most difficult element of all to handle comfortably because it does have this, as you know, my attitude is that each of these ways of being in the world is a normal, natural phase of life. And we have to be able to do all of them in due proportion in their proper time and place. But if they're overdone, then we have these imbalances and problems. And water is the toughest one to handle if it's overdone, because the phase it represents is this phase of turning inward, blocking the outflowing energy, and turning it back in on your side, on yourself, to absorb and assimilate the results of the experience that's gone before. And this is a very necessary part of life. We all have to do a certain amount of it. We digest our food and our emotional experiences and everything else. But it's just if it's overdone, then you get this sense of a person who is involuted into themselves and is so wrapped up in themselves that they are unable to get away and get perspective. And they also have this sense of the vulnerability, because water is the element of dependency at the same time, where while you are concentrating on your own inner activities, you are not running around working in the world and supporting yourself. So you have to trust to something outside yourself to take care of yourself. So you're simultaneously part of a larger matrix, aware of this connectedness with the larger whole, and yet at the same time helpless and dependent and vulnerable to the activities of the larger whole, whether or not it does do what you would like it to, take care of you, or whether in some way it's a threat to you. And because you have this open road, open door to the wider, the larger whole, water representing the subconscious, and it's through the subconscious that we get our psychic information through the non-physical channels. We have, at the same time, this psychic bombardment if we are absorbed inside and delving into the unconscious areas, tuned into them, focused on them. Then we pick up all the stuff that comes in from outside. And whatever we have inside, we're going to get more of it from the outside. If we have fear, resentments, or whatever, we're going to get more from the outside. So the deeper we go, the more comes in and pushes us down further. And the thing becomes a spiral down that's extremely uncomfortable. And the more the person feels helpless and dependent, the more they feel inadequate, and the less they feel able to do for themselves to reverse this pattern, and so they may go down into very deep depression. And the converse action to get out of this is, of course, any one of the other three elements, of course, to stop the self-absorption and turn the attention outward. And you can do this by earth, by just going to work, doing something productive with tangible results. And earth gets this satisfaction from contact with the material world and tangible results. But earth still has this heavy sense, the sense of obligation and pressure from the need to cope with, to grapple with the physical world and its threats. Now, with air and fire, these help still more to lift this depressive tendency, because fire has its basic quality is enthusiasm and self-confidence. If you have faith in yourself, you have faith you can handle the world, you can't stay down forever. You will bounce back up with the fire when the energy starts flowing out. Instead of, you reverse this inward sucking of the energy of the water and turn it out to the world. Start doing something out there, and it doesn't matter much what, as long as you're doing something you enjoy. Fire is essentially the element of joy, of dynamic vitality and its outward expression. So whether you're doing a sport that you like, something vigorous physically, or expressing love, or creating something in the world, or just challenging the world and telling it to go to hell. Whatever you're doing, if you're expressing that energy out, you're pulling yourself back up out of this depressive tendency, and the force starts flowing out again. Now, air is able to do this not by the sheer vitality drive, but because air is the element that can pull back, separate from the problem, and look at it objectively and impersonally at arm's length. Put some air between you, some space, and then without being personally involved, and water is always personally involved. They are connected. They are personally attached to whatever it is. They're immersed in it. They're swallowed up in it. And air can pull back out of this immersion and get some space between and take a look at it and say, well, it's not all that big after all, and bring it down into proportion. So the air signs also overcome this tendency to get just bogged down. And we have lots of expressive words in our language, that express these kinds of qualities that we're talking about. So essentially, it's the really heavy water that usually represents depression, and any one of the three elements can help to overcome it. But Earth is still pretty heavy if it's Taurus and Virgo. They have to be doing something productive to feel any sense of satisfaction. Taurus is better because Taurus can just enjoy something sensual, get some pleasure from this, and this will lift the shades of the depression. And the air and fire help still more. Now, what psychology calls the manic-depressive syndrome or problem is a focus primarily on water and fire. If you have these two elements primarily, you tend to be up, euphoric, and excited, and dramatic, and dynamic. When the fire is going out into expression, this is the manic phase, and you're hyperactive and hyper-excited and going. And then when the steam runs out, then the water phase sets in, and then everything collapses back inside, and then you go move down to the bottom. And the higher you've gone on the up crest, the further down you have to go on the down crest. And again, the other two elements are needed to balance. If you've got all four, great. All you need is a balance. And earth and air are rational, and they can plug along and be realistic and get out of this emotional intensity that you get with fire and water. Fire and water are the two emotional elements, and earth and air are the two rational ones. That fire essentially is energy out, emotion expressed outward. Water is the emotion turned inward. And earth is the rational energy turned down into tangible things, and air is the rational energy building up abstractions in the mind, conceptualizations in language and things like that. But they all need each other for balance. If you have a person who's all earth and air, you have a person who's pedantic, dry as dust, and just no feeling, no emotional quality, no empathy. So that's not very comfortable either, but they're not so likely to get trapped in some kind of a neurosis or psychosis. They're just going to be sitting in an ivory tower rustling papers or something, boring people. So the problem ones usually involve water and fire. Now we have also one of the big things in modern psychological problems is, of course, our old friend schizophrenia, which isn't saying anything. It's a wastebasket word, which doesn't really mean anything except that this person is functioning in a way that seems odd to us, and we don't understand it. And therefore, they must be queer. And the popular notion of it as being a split personality is just that, a popular notion which has no relevance for what schizophrenia really is defined psychologically. It just means someone who speaks or behaves in an incomprehensible fashion. They seem irrational. They don't seem to make contact with our premises, our logic, our way of understanding and handling life. And that particular problem, usually, in my experience, and this is limited, I hope to do a large study of this one of these days. We're collecting data in that category. But what I have seen so far, it usually seems to be involved in squares between the planets in or ruling the 12th house, including the natural ruler Neptune, and those in or ruling the 9th and the 3rd houses. And if it's involved with the 9th house principles, planets in or ruling it, then it's a confusion of beliefs and goals and values of some kind, which still may make other people feel you are kooky in one way or another, but it isn't quite so challenging as far as you're getting along in the everyday world. If it is a square showing inability to function in the everyday world, Gemini, 3rd house kinds of matters, and to communicate to the people around you, then you are more likely to be labeled schizophrenic. Otherwise, they'll just say, oh, he has a weird religion and let it go at that. You know, like, but there are lots of people with weird religions. But if you can't communicate and people are puzzled by you saying and doing things that they don't understand, then they may label you schizophrenic. I had a beautiful case of this with a man that I worked with off and on and saw him through 2 different hospitalizations. When I first did his chart, he'd already been in the mental hospital once, and he had had this paranoid delusional thing that, and paranoid, by the way, is a word that just means a delusional system. And so to say schizophrenia is not the same as saying paranoid, but usually schizophrenics have a paranoid delusional system of some kind, but there are all kinds of delusional systems. You can have persecution delusions, that you think the world's out to get you, or somebody in the world's out to get you, or you can have delusions of grandeur. You know, you feel that you have arrived at, you're already God and everybody should be looking up to you. You're the great Messiah teacher or something. So there are all kinds of these delusional systems. But he had one of these going, that he believed that if he performed certain religious ceremonies in the right way, he would save the world. He would have peace in the world. It was a beautiful dream, very Neptunian. He was a Pisces, and some study once did discover that there were more schizophrenics born under Pisces than any other sign. But he had a lot more than that. It takes more than Pisces by a long shot. He had Saturn in the 12th, squaring Uranus in the 3rd, in one of those lifetime squares that went on and on and on, you know, like forever. And it takes more than just Mercury to get a real good delusional system going. It takes something strong, you know, that shows this is really deep-rooted in the core of things. And so he had his Pisces squaring Gemini, and he had his 12th house squaring the 3rd house. 2 ways he had this basic conflict, and a lot of things tied into it, including Jupiter and Mercury and Uranus and Neptune, and, you know, the whole thing was involved in one way or another. And so when he came to see me, I saw that these patterns were building up to another potential breakdown, and cautioned him that if he wanted to do his religious ceremonies, that's fine, but just do them privately, you know, in his own quarters, and there's no problem. Well, he got supercharged one day and was doing them in public, and he got picked up again. He had enough sense when he got into the mental hospital. He didn't tell the psychiatrist anything. He acted very normal, and they let him out in a few weeks. And he didn't tell him anything about his delusional system. He came and told me about it, but he didn't tell them. So then another time was coming up, and I gave him a little more urgent thing, you know, take it easy. Just don't do it in public. It's all right to do your special thing, and you know, the world needs prayer, and it needs saving, goodness knows. But so anyway, one day it was too much for him, and he was out doing his thing in the middle of the street, and cars nearly hit him, and then they picked him up again and back to the hospital again. And again, he kept quiet when he got in the hospital, acted normal, and they let him out in a few weeks. Now, since then, I've lost track. But the thing seems to be partly just that we get this type of mind gets this feeling of the reality of their own dream so strongly that even though one part of their mind is quite aware that this is impossible, it's still so beautiful and such a great hope that they will try to do something to bring it about. And there probably are people who simply have a breakdown in their whole rational functioning. I haven't worked with any myself, but this can be at any level, of course, of breakdown in the ability to distinguish our dreams, our fantasies, our imagination from the tangible things of the world, the logic and sense in the world. So when I'll know more after I get through the study, but at the moment, this is the kind of pattern that I look for that. And did you have a question?
Yes, what does hereditary have to do with the man that picked up quite a few times?
As far as I know, he did not have a history of any kind of mental breakdown in the family. If he did, I didn't know about it. I think that we will find someday, as I say, I believe in reincarnation. I think people come back into a family to learn what to do and what not to do. And if you come into a family that has a history of these kind of breakdowns, it's supposed to be a lesson to you to take a good look and not repeat the pattern. And you may or may not learn it. If you don't learn it vicariously from seeing the destructive effects, then you go through it and learn it yourself by your own suffering. But that's my feeling about it, but I can't prove it. So I think the hereditary pattern is just something we come into if that's what we have to learn to cope with. Anyway, the whole thing of schizophrenia and delusions and all is a very mixed bag, and there will be some people who are put in this category who really are confused in their thinking. There may be brain damage, and they simply can't function anymore in terms of brain conscious patterns, control of these things. There are many times there will be a person who is using this as a way of getting out of something they don't want to do. It's a way of escaping the responsibilities of the world, making the world take care of them. And it's easier to go and create their dream world, whether they do it on the back ward or whether they get it out of a bottle or a pill, than to cope with the real world and try to bring their dreams down into reality. So there are plenty of times when this is a kind of way of making the world do what we want to do without having to face our own obligations in it and accept responsibility for ourselves. Now, there are undoubtedly lots of other syndromes, but the psychological things, I think personally, while very interesting, I think in time are going to be, to some extent, superseded by the natural categories of challenge or inner conflict which astrology offers us, which seems to seem to me to be exemplified beautifully in the horoscope by what I call the 3 dilemmas.